Welcome back, class. All right, let's talk about Southern agriculture and King Cotton. So tobacco, rice, and sugarcane all are going to fall below cotton. Even though those were very profitable, they couldn't touch it in the South. Slaves went from about 1 million to 800,000, depending on the reports that you read, to over 4 million from 1800 to 1860 because of the demand with the new cotton front. So you're going to see that is going to be put on the back of slave labor, particularly African-American slave labor. Southern legislatures are going to add increased restriction, particularly on things like education and marriage for people of African descent in the South. Economics were basically at the owner's demand. You might be forced into being a house servant, which, although was usually less labor, you were more inflicted to spend more time with these people who were often very cruel to you. Also, most hard labor was in the field, and that is where the majority of people of involuntary servitude found themselves. And also, you had some construction and a small amount in factories, very little, but just to mention. In 1860, a filled slave was worth over $2,000 in 1860. So that value is going to become exponential. Families could be separated. The owners could sell a slave, the wife, the husband, the children without any consent. Also, women were often subjugated to sexual exploitations by masters and even men that were not connected to their farms. So this was a horrible thing. There was still a strong sense of family, however, though, in the African slave communities. You still had this, what is often called the maroon communities, where they would develop this sense of family and deep connection to one another. You do have some instances of resistance. Denmark Vesey in 1822 attempted a resistance, and the most famous is definitely Nat Turner in 1831. 250,000 of African Americans in the South were free. So there was a free population, but very, very small. So that means 1 out of 17 African Americans who lived in the South roughly at the time of the Civil War would have been free. Most lived in the cities, still not able to vote, still not able to have certain jobs, still often kept from skilled labor, and often there was a danger of being kidnapped, as we know with the new fugitive slave law. All right, so a little bit about white society. The planters, you had most of the people in the South were poor whites, or mountain people. It was elite. You had this very, very elite group that had 100 plus slaves, about 1,000 plus acres, and dominated state government. They controlled everything. Everything was about benefiting them. It's basically like big business, but in the farming center of the Cotton South. Farmers owned fewer than 20 slaves, several hundred acres, and worked with their own slaves because there was more work to be done than could be done with 20 people. And then you have your poor whites. This is 3/4 of the South, often referred to as your poor white trash. These were your mountain people, small farmers in frontier area. Many included people like Andrew Johnson, who eventually will become president and then be impeached. And they remained loyal oftentimes to the North because they resented those wealthy in the South. Education was mostly for upper class only, and elementary was available for most of the rest if you were white. Most African slaves were denied the right to education. In fact, most states passed laws that outlawed it altogether. Religion and slavery in the South were often hand in hand and occasionally in conflict, but not, sadly, often enough. In the West, natives regularly were pushed off their land. By 1850, most Native Americans were west of the Mississippi River. Horses made life for them very mobile. In fact, the plain natives, their life was possible because of the horse. They were able to move around and hunt the buffalo and do what they needed to do. Frontier farming was hard and brutal, and even the women who worked on the frontiers would work diligently just as hard as their husbands because there was just so much to be done on the farm. The age of Jackson, between 1824 and 1840, politics moved from the house of the rich planters and merchants and the mid and lower class homes. You begin to see Jackson is going to bring some of your poor into the scene. Starting to pick up on the wind now. Universal male suffrage. By about 1840, all white men could vote. Now, that doesn't seem like progress, but considering it is somewhat progress. You're still not seeing women voting. You're still not seeing African American voting, but you're no longer seeing property ties required to vote. Party nominating committees, the people were allowed to choose their candidates. You see this with both the Whigs and the Democrats. And in this time, you begin to see the rise of that third party, the anti-Masons, as well as the Know Nothing Party, which was the anti-immigrant party. All right. Jackson increased state and local positions, as we said. By 1824, The mudslinging in the elections was insane. It was almost like a sport. In that particular election, things are going to get really brutal, and this is the one where Jackson ends up losing. Adams was chosen despite the fact no guy had a clear majority. The vote was majorly split, and this is the end of the Democratic Republicans. Jackson had more votes than anyone else, but not a majority. Adams came in second, and then you have Crawford and Clay came in fourth. And so since the top three go to Congress, Clay swings all of his support to Adams. And so because of that, Adams is going to be named the president. So the election of 1828 is going to come after that favorite son election that Jackson was so mad at baby Adams for what he had done. And so with the election of 1824, the mudslinging picks up dramatically, particularly being brought in about Rachel and how Rachel was technically married to Jackson and Roberts at the same time. Remember the whole bigamy thing? And she ended up didn't know it. It was a whole mistake. Anyway, it upsets her so much that before Jackson takes the White House, after he was elected, between that time, the lame duck period, she's actually going to die. And that's going to be a big issue, as we know. Jackson is going to come out guns blazing. He vetoes 12 bills of Congress. He doesn't pick people who just are people. He picks people who are highly supportive of him. And so this is where we see that start of that spoils system. Another thing we see with Jackson that I want to point out is he pocket vetoes. The things that he doesn't think the veto will stand on, he pocket vetoes them until they die. Also, we see the kitchen cabinet. He replaces his senators that are his cabinet members who did not support him with people who were his friends, and he would go to them for advice and not actual people who were experts. We also see this is going to kind of explode with the Eaton affair, where Senator Eaton's wife, Peggy Eaton, was not a lady of a good reputation. And because she was snubbed at an event and the ladies of Washington refused to address her appropriately, Jackson decides, you know what, I'm done with all of you. And so he threatens to fire members of his cabinet. He ends up losing several, as well as his vice president through this. That was over a veto he made of the Mays Road bill. All right, so 1830, we see Jackson is really going to push for the Indian Removal Act. There's going to be a couple of court cases where the Supreme Court says, you know what, you're right, it's your land, and Jack stuff, it's the middle of winter, many die on the way. So the tariff nullification, the tariff was particularly high during this time, and South Carolina was particularly bitter because it was hard on people who bought from overseas. And other countries would up our tariff to reciprocate the high tariff we were putting on them. And so what's going to happen here is Jackson is going to support the tariff because it's what Congress passed. And South Carolina says they're going to nullify it. They're not going to listen. And Jackson says, you know what, I'm going to hang every person in South Carolina from a tree. He asks for a forced bill of war. Congress is like, whoa. And so Henry Clay comes in and he works out a compromise to kind of generally scale down the tariff. And it's kind of, nobody loves it, but it's good for everybody. All right. So let's talk about Jackson and the bank. Jackson absolutely hated the bank, and the first chance he got rid of it, and that was in his second term when the veto, he passes the veto for the bank that says no more Bank of the U.S. He instead wants state banks or pet banks that allow easy money, easier loans, which we know with easy money, easy credit, that it's harder to get those loans paid back because usually the people are not as qualified. He wants more specie circulaire. Is what he wants, more gold and silver. But he says, nope, paper money. We're doing paper money. We're going to get these people out there. We're going to make this happen. 1836, his second vice president, Van Buren, is going to easily be elected because of Jackson's supporters. However, before Van Buren even takes office, things start to go to crap. We have this huge panic of 1837 based on a bad deal with the grain supply, as well as the failure of the banks. And Van Buren is going to be dramatically devastated. Despite trying to establish an independent treasury to support our money system, he's going to be devastated by the actions of Andrew Jackson. And so in 1840, the Whigs are strongly going to defeat Van Buren. They're going to run William Henry Harrison, the Indian killer from the Red Stick Confederation that is going to start the whole curse thing that we talked about. He's the log cabins and hard cider guy, and he is going to die. And he is going to be replaced with John Tyler. So that's it for today.